Imagine being forced into a marriage not of love, but of obligation. Imagine standing beside someone whose arrogance filled every corner of the room. Yet, on the very night you vowed to spend forever together, he said something that shattered every assumption, every wall, and every fear. That is where this story begins. When life corners us into choices we never wanted to make, our hearts often learn lessons we never thought we needed. She was a woman with dreams stitched together by passion, a young writer who found beauty in words and believed love should be something that grew, not something that was forced. But fate, as cruel as it can sometimes be, had a different plan. Her father's business was sinking, debt shadowed every corner of their home, and whispers of ruin haunted every night. In desperation, he turned to the one man who could save him, Dr. Adrian Blackwell, a man of success, wealth, and an ego that reached as high as his reputation. His condition was simple, almost chillingly so. He would save her father's empire if she agreed to become his wife. She didn't say yes out of love, she said yes out of loyalty. How could she stand by and watch her father, the man who had raised her with so much love, lose everything? So she agreed, even though the word marriage felt like a sentence, not a promise. The day she signed those papers, she didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a pawn, a piece in a game she hadn't agreed to play. Her friends whispered about her luck, about how marrying a successful doctor was every woman's dream, but they didn't know the truth. Her heart wasn't racing with excitement, it was drowning in quiet dread. The wedding was beautiful, at least from the outside. The hall was decorated in white roses and golden chandeliers, cameras flashing like lightning. Everyone smiled, everyone clapped, everyone except her. As she stood at the altar, her eyes met his. Dr. Adrian Blackwell, tall, confident, and terrifyingly composed. His gaze was unreadable, as if he wasn't looking at a woman, but at an agreement. His hand was cold when he slipped the ring onto her finger, and his voice was steady when he said the words, "I do." But there was no softness, no emotion. To him, this was duty. To her, this was surrender. When the crowd cheered and confetti rained down, she felt none of it. Every cheer sounded like an echo of something lost. She smiled for the cameras, but behind that practiced smile, her heart whispered a silent truth. She was now bound to a man she didn't know, didn't love, and perhaps could never understand. That night, as she sat by the window of their new home, watching the city lights blur behind her tears, she realized something. Even the most beautiful cage is still a cage. She had traded her freedom for her father's future, and though her decision was noble, it came with a price: her peace. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them was more than physical. He was a man of precision, his life scheduled by the minute, his emotions sealed behind professionalism. He left early, returned late, and when he spoke, it was brief and formal. She often wondered if he even remembered she existed beyond the title of wife. At dinner, silence became their third companion. She tried to start conversations, to find some trace of warmth, but he would respond with a polite nod or a distracted hum, eyes fixed on his phone or the medical files in his hands. It was as if the man she'd married had built invisible walls around himself, walls she could neither climb nor break. And yet, beneath her frustration and sadness, there was something else: curiosity. What kind of man hides behind such arrogance? What made him so guarded, so detached from the world around him? Late at night, she would hear him pacing in his study, talking softly to himself, sometimes even breaking down in silence. It was in those moments she saw glimpses of something raw, something real. But by morning, he would be back to the same distant figure, the same man who made her feel like a stranger in her own marriage. She began to realize that perhaps arrogance wasn't his nature, it was his defense. A fortress he built to protect a heart that had long stopped trusting anyone. Her friends would ask how married life was, and she would laugh it off. Perfect. She'd lie, painting false smiles over deep cracks. Because how could she explain that love wasn't missing because of hate, it was missing because of emptiness? There was no fire between them, only ice. But what she didn't know then was that life has a strange way of melting the coldest hearts, often in the most unexpected moments. Though she saw their union as a sacrifice, fate saw it as a story just beginning, one that would unravel truths about him, about herself, and about the meaning of love that exists not in perfection, but in patience. To the world, Dr. Adrian Blackwell was the epitome of success, a man whose name commanded respect, whose achievements filled medical journals, and whose reputation was as untouchable as his confidence. But to her he was something else entirely, a man made of glass and granite, polished on the outside but fragile within. From the moment they began their life together, his arrogance filled every room before he even spoke. He walked with the posture of someone who knew he was better than most, and every word he uttered carried the weight of authority. To her, it felt less like marriage and more like cohabiting with a storm that never raged loud enough to destroy, but never quieted enough to bring peace. He treated life like a clinical operation, precise, detached, and emotionless. Everything had a method, a schedule, a formula. He would wake before dawn, his movements sharp and rehearsed, his eyes already calculating the day ahead. He spoke to his assistants with brisk efficiency, to his colleagues with unyielding dominance, and to her with politeness, not cruelty, not kindness, just politeness. A kind of distant courtesy that made her feel more like a house guest than a wife. When she tried to joke or smile, he would glance at her as if unsure how to respond, as if laughter was a foreign language he'd never learned. She began to wonder if he even knew how to feel, or if he'd long replaced his heart with logic and his humanity with control. But arrogance, she would soon learn, isn't always pride. Sometimes it's pain dressed in power. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when she caught a glimpse of the man beneath the facade. Once, she saw him sitting in his study, staring at a framed photograph of a younger version of himself standing beside an older man, his father, perhaps. His expression wasn't proud then. It was hollow. She didn't dare ask, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Another time, she overheard him speaking on the phone, his voice low and strained. "I did everything you wanted," he said. "Everything." The call ended abruptly, and when he noticed her standing nearby, his walls shot back up instantly. His tone hardened, his face turned cold. "You should knock before entering," he said, and walked away without another word. In those moments, she realized that his arrogance wasn't an act of superiority, it was his armor. A man who had built himself from the ashes of expectation and pressure, who had learned that vulnerability was weakness, and that the only way to be respected was to never be soft. He wore arrogance the way soldiers wear armor, not to attack, but to survive, and though she wanted to hate him for it, she couldn't. Because deep down, she knew what it meant to hide behind strength when the world demanded perfection. His silence wasn't empty, it was heavy with things unsaid, emotions unexpressed, and battles he fought quietly behind the mask of success. Still, his indifference stung. She would spend hours decorating the dining room, preparing dinners, hoping that perhaps tonight he'd notice her efforts, but his eyes always stayed fixed on his phone or his reports. When she tried to ask about his day, he would answer in clipped, distant words, fine, productive, long. Nothing more. One evening, she dared to ask, "Do you ever get tired of being perfect?" He looked at her for a long time, then replied with chilling simplicity, "Perfection is easier than disappointment." She didn't respond, but that sentence echoed in her mind for days. It wasn't arrogance that spoke in those words, it was exhaustion. A man too afraid to fail, too afraid to feel. And yet, as cold as he seemed, there was one thing she couldn't ignore: his actions always contradicted his demeanor. When she once burned her hand cooking, he didn't scold her or panic. He simply took her wrist gently, applied ointment, and wrapped it in silence. No words, no emotion, just quiet care. When she fell ill one evening, he rearranged his entire schedule, cancelled surgeries, and sat by her bedside reading medical notes under dim light. His face drawn with concern he refused to show. In the stillness of those moments, she saw the truth: the arrogant doctor wasn't heartless. He was afraid that if he ever opened his heart, it would be taken advantage of. Afraid that if he let someone see his pain, they would leave. She began to understand that arrogance in its cruelest form is often just fear in disguise, fear of rejection, fear of love, fear of being seen. The man everyone admired for his confidence was, in truth, terrified of intimacy. And the woman who had once seen him as impossible began to see him as human. She didn't know it yet, but her quiet patience was beginning to chip away at his armor, revealing the scars he'd hidden from the world and from himself. The mask of arrogance was cracking, not through confrontation, but through kindness. And sometimes, the most powerful change doesn't come from breaking someone's walls, it comes from simply waiting for them to lower it on their own. Love, when forced to exist between two opposites, often becomes a battlefield not of violence, but of silence, pride, and misunderstanding. Their marriage was no different. Theirs was a home divided not by walls, but by temperament. She was warmth, expression, and heart. He was logic, precision, and reason. She spoke in emotions, he answered in facts. She believed in the beauty of chaos, he believed in the power of order. Every day together was a tug-of-war between two souls determined to be right, yet terrified of being vulnerable. And somewhere between their words and silences, affection tried to grow only to be trampled by their pride. Mornings in their home were quiet, almost mechanical. He would rise early, iron his white coat, check his watch, and leave before she could even say good morning. She would watch from the window as his car disappeared down the street, wondering if he even noticed how empty the house felt when he left. When he returned late at night, tired and distant, she would have dinner ready, but he'd often eat silently, his mind elsewhere. "You work too much," she once said softly. Without looking up, he replied, "Work doesn't argue with me." That one sentence hurt more than she could admit. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he didn't know how to show it. And she didn't know how to reach a man who built walls higher than his pride. Still, she wasn't one to stay quiet forever. Her spirit was made of fire, and her patience, though vast, wasn't endless. One evening, after another long day of silence, she finally confronted him. "Do you even see me, Adrian?" she asked, her voice trembling between anger and hurt. "I'm here every day trying to make this work, but you treat me like I'm invisible." He looked up from his notes, unfazed. "This marriage was never about love," he said calmly. "You knew that from the start." His words were a blade sharp, deliberate, and cruel. She stood there, blinking back tears, realizing that sometimes it's not the shouting that breaks a heart, it's the calmness of indifference. She left the room without another word, her footsteps echoing louder than any argument could. Days passed, and tension hung in the air like unspoken thunder. But behind the silence, small changes began to appear, almost imperceptible, but real. When she fell asleep at the study desk while reading, he quietly covered her with a blanket. When she forgot to eat, he would leave a glass of juice by her bedside before heading to work. He never mentioned these gestures, never sought credit. It was as if his care was something he didn't want her to see, afraid that acknowledging it would make him vulnerable, and yet she saw it all. She began to realize that their clash wasn't born of hate, it was born of fear. He feared connection, she feared rejection. They were both protecting themselves from being hurt by each other, even as they unknowingly hurt one another. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and a thunderstorm raged outside. The electricity flickered, and she sat by the window, lost in thought. Hours passed, and still, he hadn't returned from the hospital. Worry gnawed at her chest. When he finally walked through the door, drenched from the rain, she couldn't hold back. "Do you have any idea how worried I was?" She burst out, tears in her voice. He frowned, unbuttoning his coat. "You don't need to worry about me." "But I do," she shouted, "because whether you like it or not, you're my husband, and I—" She stopped herself, realizing what she was about to say. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. He looked at her, for the first time really looked at her, and in his eyes was something she hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not annoyance, but confusion. and a flicker of emotion he couldn't name. He walked closer, his voice lower now. "Why do you care?" he asked. She shook her head, wiping her tears. "Because someone has to." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "No one ever has." That sentence, spoken barely above a whisper, broke through every layer of ice between them. It was the first honest thing he'd said to her. The first time his walls cracked enough for her to see the pain beneath the perfection. And in that moment, their clash no longer felt like a war, it felt like the beginning of understanding. For the first time, she saw the man behind the arrogance, and he saw the woman who refused to give up on him. Two worlds that had spent so long colliding finally paused, caught in the fragile balance between hate and healing. But of course, this was only the beginning. The air between them had shifted, not yet warm, but no longer cold. The walls were still standing, but now there were cracks in them. And sometimes cracks are the first sign that light is finally finding its way in. The night of truth doesn't always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it slips in quietly, wearing the stillness of the hour, waiting for the right breath, the right heartbeat to break everything open. Their wedding night had long passed without tenderness or words. It had been an arrangement sealed in silence. But this night, months after vows that meant nothing and days filled with unspoken chaos, was different. It began like every other evening, the clock ticking too loudly, the sound of distant rain against the glass, and the space between them thick with everything they'd never said. Yet something in the air felt heavier, as if the universe had decided it was time to strip away every mask they'd worn. She sat by the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass-tired eyes, trembling fingers, and a heart caught between love and resentment. She had stopped waiting for warmth from him, yet tonight, she couldn't escape the ache of wanting to understand him. Why he hid behind silence, why he built walls so high no one could climb them. When she heard the door open, she didn't turn immediately. His footsteps echoed through the house, slow, deliberate, as if he too felt the weight of the moment. He walked in, his presence filling the room not with arrogance this time, but with a strange, restless energy she couldn't name. Their eyes met, and for the first time he didn't look away. Adrian stood there, his expression unreadable, the usual composure gone. "You're still awake," he said quietly. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I couldn't sleep." The words hung between them like fragile glass. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from long hours at work, but the kind that comes from carrying a lifetime of burdens. His shoulders seemed heavier, his face paler. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. He hesitated before replying, "You wouldn't understand." She rose from her chair then, something inside her snapping. "Then make me understand," she said, her voice trembling, "because I can't keep pretending this is normal. I can't keep living with someone who looks at me like a stranger." For a moment, he said nothing, just silence, the kind that screams louder than words. Then he exhaled, almost in defeat, and walked toward the window where she had been sitting. The rain outside had grown heavier, each drop tapping against the glass like the rhythm of their unspoken truth. "You think I'm arrogant," he began slowly, his voice low. "You think I don't care, but you have no idea what it costs me to be this way." She frowned, taken aback by the crack in his tone. He continued, his eyes distant. "When I was 10, I watched my mother walk out on my father. She said she couldn't live with a man who loved his work more than his family. I told myself I'd never let anyone see me weak like him. I swore I'd never need anyone that much." He turned to her then, his voice trembling. "And then I met you." The room seemed to freeze. Her lips parted, but no words came. His confession hung in the air, raw and unfinished. "You were supposed to be a formality," he admitted. "A favor, a deal, a name on paper. But when I saw you, the way you looked at life, the way you fought back, something shifted. I hated it. I hated how much space you began to take in my mind." His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "You made me feel things I'd spent years burying." Her breath caught in her throat. This was not the man she'd married, this was someone stripped of his armor. standing before her with all his wounds exposed. "So I pushed you away," he said, "because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let you close enough, you'd see the broken parts I've spent my whole life hiding." She didn't know when the tears began to fall, his or hers. For so long, she'd imagined him as heartless, untouchable, impossible to love. But now, standing before her, he looked human, lost, vulnerable. She stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "You think weakness is needing someone," she whispered. "But it isn't. It's refusing to let anyone in, even when you're drowning." He met her eyes, and for the first time since their wedding, there was no distance, no mask, only truth. "I don't know how to be what you need," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Then start by being honest," she said. "That's all I've ever wanted." The rain outside softened, but inside the storm finally broke, not in anger but in revelation. For the first time he wasn't Dr. Adrian Blackwell, the untouchable surgeon, the arrogant husband. He was just a man, one who had been terrified of love all his life and had finally spoken the truth that had haunted him for years. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, in that fragile, quiet moment, she realized that the most powerful kind of truth isn't shouted, it's whispered through trembling lips when there's nothing left to lose. Sometimes a single sentence can alter the entire rhythm of two lives. Sometimes one moment of truth can dismantle years of distance. That night, when their walls finally cracked, something fragile yet powerful emerged: honesty. The air between them was charged, heavy with all the things they'd both tried to suppress. He stood in front of her, his eyes searching hers, unsure if his confession had freed him or exposed him. She didn't speak at first. She couldn't. Words felt too small to hold the weight of everything he had just admitted. The rain outside was a whisper now, as if even the world had gone quiet to hear what would be said next. He turned away, his hand running through his hair, his breath uneven. "You think I don't care," he said, voice trembling with the effort of staying composed. "But every time I saw you smile, every time you looked at me with those eyes, I wanted to be the kind of man who could deserve that." She felt her throat tighten. He continued, softer now, as though the words were fighting their way out. "I know I've been cold and cruel even, but it wasn't because I wanted to hurt you. It's because I didn't know how to need someone without losing control." He paused, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "But when you stood up to me, when you refused to be silent, you reminded me that I was alive, and that scared me more than anything." Her heart pounded as she listened, every word peeling back another layer of the man she thought she knew. "Adrian," she whispered, his name trembling on her lips like a prayer. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the first time, there was no pride in his eyes, only pain and longing. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "I've spent so long building this life, this image, that I forgot what it meant to feel anything real. But that night at our wedding, when you walked down the aisle, something in me broke. You looked terrified and beautiful, and I remember thinking, what have I done?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I didn't expect to care, but I did, and I still do." Those words, "I did, and I still do," hit her like lightning. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was the first crack of dawn after a long, sleepless night. She felt tears rising, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from recognition of truth, of change, of the small miracle unfolding before her. "Then why didn't you ever say that?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because I didn't think I deserved to," he said simply. "You were light, and I've lived too long in shadows, loving someone like you. It felt like asking for something I had no right to have." He looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the truth is, I fell for you the moment you stopped trying to please me, the moment you stood your ground and made me see myself for what I'd become." The room was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of distance, it was the silence of transformation. Every heartbeat felt louder than words. Every breath shared between them carried the weight of what they'd both been afraid to say. She took a small step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't need to deserve me," she said softly. "You just need to choose me." For a second, his expression faltered: confusion, disbelief, then something softer, something unguarded. He shook his head slowly. I don't know if I can give you what you need. She smiled faintly, tears spilling freely now. Then start with honesty. That's all I've ever wanted from you. He closed the distance between them, each step hesitant, as though afraid she might disappear if he came too close. When he finally stood before her, his voice was barely a whisper. You changed everything, he said. You made me see that love isn't weakness, it's the only thing that's ever made me strong. His words fell like a confession and a promise all at once. And in that moment, every barrier that had once separated them, pride, fear, misunderstanding, began to dissolve. She didn't answer him, not with words, but with a silence that spoke louder than speech. For the first time since their marriage began, they were no longer strangers sharing a house. They were two souls standing in the wreckage of their walls, daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, something beautiful could be rebuilt from the ruins. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew it something had shifted forever. The man who had once treated love as a weakness had finally surrendered to its truth, and the woman who had once felt invisible had become the reason he learned to see. The words he spoke that night didn't just change her, they changed him. They were the beginning of a healing neither of them had known they needed. In the days that followed, something changed, not with grand gestures or declarations, but in quiet, almost invisible ways. The house, once filled with silence and unspoken tension, began to breathe again. It was as if the air itself had softened. He still left early for the hospital, but now he paused before leaving, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer than before. Sometimes he would leave a note beside her breakfast, small, simple things like take your medicine or don't skip lunch. They weren't love letters, but to her, they felt like seeds of something real, something fragile and growing. The arrogance that had once cloaked him so tightly had begun to peel away, revealing glimpses of the man he had always been beneath it all, flawed, human, and finally willing to be seen. She, too, began to change. For so long, she had lived like a guest in her own home, careful not to disturb, cautious not to feel too deeply. But now, she found herself wanting to understand him, not just as a husband, but as a man who had been taught that emotion was weakness. She began to notice the small details, the way his hands trembled slightly when he was deep in thought, the way he always double-checked the locks before bed, as if haunted by something he couldn't name. She started leaving small traces of warmth in his world, a cup of coffee waiting when he returned late, a soft light left on in his study. They weren't acts of obligation anymore. They were acts of quiet love, spoken not in words, but in consistency. Their conversations changed too. What had once been surface-level exchanges, how was work, fine, began to stretch into something deeper. One evening, while sitting on the balcony, he told her about his first surgery, how he'd nearly frozen with fear before making the first incision. She listened, not as the wife of a doctor, but as the keeper of his secrets. I thought I'd fail, he admitted. Everyone sees confidence when I walk into a room, but the truth is, it's all I know how to show. She smiled softly and said, confidence isn't the absence of fear, Adrian. It's moving through it. He looked at her for a long time, as if hearing something he'd never considered before. That night, when he said good night, his voice carried warmth instead of formality, and that single shift felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The more they opened to each other, the more they discovered how alike they truly were beneath their differences. He, who had built his life around precision, found comfort in her chaos, her laughter, her stories, her spontaneity. She, who had once been fragile, found strength in his steadiness. It wasn't a perfect harmony, there were still moments of misunderstanding, days when pride resurfaced like an old wound, but now they both tried. That was the difference. He apologized when he was wrong, and she forgave without resentment. Slowly, they learned the art of meeting halfway. He started coming home earlier. She started saving him a seat beside her during dinner, not across. Their home was no longer a house of strangers, it was becoming a place of healing. But understanding isn't born in comfort, it's born in vulnerability. One evening, she found him sitting alone in his study, staring at the same photograph she'd seen months ago, him and his father. This time, she asked softly, "You miss him, don't you?" He hesitated before nodding. "He was the first person to call me arrogant," he said bitterly. "He said I'd end up alone if I didn't learn how to listen. I told him I didn't need anyone. The next day, he died of a heart attack." His voice cracked. "I never got to say I was sorry." She stepped closer, her eyes filling. "You're saying it now," she whispered. And in that moment, he finally let himself cry, not the quiet, controlled tears of a man trying to hold dignity, but the raw, unguarded tears of someone who'd carried too much for too long. She held him, saying nothing, because sometimes silence is the only language that love needs. From then on, something profound took root between them, not passion born of fantasy, but connection born of truth. He began to smile more easily, to laugh without restraint, to touch her hand without hesitation. And she, once afraid to hope, began to trust that this love, the kind that grows slowly, tenderly, through understanding, was worth every tear, every battle, every scar. They had started as strangers, bound by circumstance, torn by pride, and healed by honesty. And though their journey was far from over, one thing had become clear. Love doesn't always begin with attraction or perfection. Sometimes it begins with pain, honesty, and the courage to finally say, "I see you, all of you." Love, she realized, was never about perfection, it was about patience. It wasn't about finding someone who fit her expectations, but someone who challenged them, broke them, and helped her rebuild stronger. The arrogant doctor she had once despised had become the man who taught her that even the coldest hearts can learn to feel again. And he, who once believed emotions made him weak, had discovered that love was the only thing that had ever made him strong. Their story wasn't a fairy tale, it was a journey through fire, through fear, through everything that made them human. They fought, they broke, and they rebuilt. They learned that love isn't born in grand gestures or perfect promises, it's born in the quiet moments. In forgiveness, in understanding, in the courage to stay when everything in you wants to run. On the night he told her the truth, she finally saw him, not the doctor, not the husband forced upon her, but the man who had learned to love her in his own flawed, beautiful way. And as he took her hand and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me," she smiled, knowing she never really had. Because love, when it's real, doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be true. So when people asked her later, "What did he say on your wedding night that left you speechless?" she would smile and say, "It wasn't what he said that left me speechless, it was what he became." Because in the end, love isn't about changing someone to fit your heart, it's about opening your heart wide enough to let them in as they are. And that, more than anything else, is the miracle of understanding.